In this segment, we're discussing the legacy of the civil rights movement and specifically the struggle of African Americans to be recognized under the law as full citizens. And in the center of the screen is a picture of Martin Luther King Jr. leading a peaceful protest down a street. Ironically, it is laid over a picture of the Women's March that took place in 2017. This one's from San Diego, and in it is a picture of Martin Luther King Jr. I did not actually plan that. All right. So what are civil rights? As we've talked about, they are laws or rights that require the government to intervene or act on someone's behalf. And as laws, they define who or what should be protected. So they can create a whole protected class, for example, of people. And by defining rights, it means that you should be able to be free from discrimination. Some examples could include workers' rights, and the picture on the screen there depicts Cesar Chavez leading workers who wanted, for example, to be able to get breaks during the day. Should you have the right to have a break after a certain number of hours of working in the fields? If you're a refugee, should you have the right to stay in America if you make it here and not be deported? Because if you were, you might be killed when you return to your home country. Should you have the right to gay marriage? These are all kinds of protections or rights that we consider to be, at this point, fair, but they don't just come out of nowhere. And in this sense, civil rights must be established, and they usually take a long time to be recognized. There are some lessons that we can gather and glean from the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. The first was that protest is not enough. As you saw in the last segment, you can scream all you want, but if no one's listening, your screams go nowhere. Someone needs to be listening, and your voice needs to be heard by someone, and that someone needs to actually do something about it. So lesson number 2 is that to establish some kind of new right or to recognize a right that should exist, those who make and enforce the law must recognize it and treat it as such. And this must happen at more than one level or by more than one entity. And in government, we have, of course, a separated system with an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch. And all 3 of those actually must coordinate their responses. So on the one hand, you need to create legal protections for that right, for example, by establishing a new law, by writing new law, or by recognizing a clause and interpreting it, one that's already in the Constitution, or maybe adding to the Constitution. You would want to defend it through case law, that is by bringing a court case and having a judge write an opinion about it, and then having higher courts validate that. Those then become precedents and established kinds of principles that future laws or future cases are going to be decided upon. You also want to defend that right through the use or the threat of the use of force. So all 3 of these kinds of approaches through enforcement and through legally validating or verifying a right exists, and by writing laws and making sure that they are formalized through an institution, those 3 things have to happen, usually have to happen. So lesson number 2 to continue this is that a coordinated response by government is usually needed. And with respect to civil rights, advances occurred when a national majority took up a minority's cause. In other words, at the federal level, at least, all branches must possess political will for rights to be established. So what does that mean, to have political will or to be willing to use public authority to enact new rights? Well, that kind of willingness can stem from many sources, among them personal ambition or moral certitude. A president, for example, like LBJ, might take up the cause of civil rights because he feels it's the right thing to do. In that case, you would be called a policy entrepreneur, somebody who really just wants to take on that role and sees the opportunity and do something about it. That could be somebody like Senator Muskie, who actually established environmental rights through the Environmental movement of the late 60s and early 70s and got Nixon to sign on. Willingness can also come from public pressure that is put on politicians. And that often comes from changing mores or social norms. As the public decides that something is right or wrong, they're going to start putting pressure on their politicians to act. And so, and where does that softening, or where do the changing mores come from? Well, often the public will soften up to new ideas or different principles. And as that happens, they pressure their politicians to take action. And in response, politicians want to act because they want to be reelected. So that reelection incentive drives action. And they also will feel a need to satisfy their core supporters. For example, why did civil rights really take off in the 60s? Well, Democrats who had the majority in both houses of Congress realized that they were going to lose their core supporters unless they actually responded to their cries for help and for the need for civil rights. Focusing events or even windows of opportunity can open, and that can also kind of crank open that jar of political will, if you will. And by doing that, when the timing is just right, people may just go ahead and act. The foundation, of course, was laid in the 1960s, and one of the other lessons we can take away from the civil rights movement at that point was that they built a foundation of laws, of judicial precedents, that is, court opinions, and administrative regulations. So rules that were coming out of the federal government that could be extended to other groups who were also experiencing discrimination. Women, for example, really started to take up the mantle again in 1972. We're going to look at that in just a second. Disability rights were established in the 1990s. Back in the 1980s, what was called gay rights, now LGBTQ rights, really gained a lot of momentum. And they've been able, these groups in turn, and we can also talk about Hispanic Latino rights and Asian American rights, et cetera. These groups have really been able to make headway because of the groundwork that was laid by the African American civil rights movement. The American or women's rights is a real case in point. Women have always sought to be recognized as a protected class. Legally through court cases and laws and in the Constitution, because gender and sex, neither of those are mentioned in the Constitution. And so really through enforcing laws about equal protection or equal pay is how women have approached being protected and not being discriminated against, such as getting the same amount of pay for the same kind of work. They also tried to do so by getting an Equal Rights Amendment added to the Constitution. And the first time this was actually introduced into Congress was 1923. It was introduced every single year until 1972, when finally 2/3 of both the House and the Senate proposed the amendment and then sent it on to the states for ratification. Now, they did put a time limit on it. And this very radical amendment reads, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." Wow, revolutionary. And yet only 35 states ratified it. The Congress, Section 2 also says Congress shall have the power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article, and it should take effect 2 years after it's ratified. Now, it is so sort of dormant at this point, except in March 2017, Nevada sort of symbolically did add themselves to the list, and they became the 36th state to ratify this amendment. And so 2 more states to go. The equalrightsamendment.org organization believes there may be a path to still getting it added to the Constitution if 2 more states ratify it. One more lesson is that progress takes many forms. It can come in the form of court case, a landmark court case, such as Brown v. Board of Education, or it could come in the form of a law like the Civil Rights Law, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But it only occurs incrementally. That is little step by little step by little step. In the 1970s, legislation moved from the courts to the federal bureaucracy, meaning that progress on civil rights really was taking place by people suing and getting a decision in their favor. Does the law protect me in this way? Does it protect me under this condition or that condition? And so the courts are really seen as a major vehicle for establishing rights, and they still are. But that fight has also been moved to the federal bureaucracy, meaning administrative agencies which administer different kinds of programs for people, for citizens. And Congress redefined discrimination in a very particular way. So they took the focus off of the outcome of local practices and put it they put the focus on the outcome of local practices rather than on the intent. So that means if you go take let's say you want to say that you were discriminated against, you were not allowed to get an apartment because of the color of your skin. If you wanted to sue successfully, you might have to prove that somebody intended to harm you and discriminate against you. But Congress actually redefined discrimination in the 70s and 80s with respect to schooling or education and housing and workplace, so that that a person really only needed to prove that despite what someone intended, a whole class of people was being discriminated against, that a whole class of people was not being protected. So if you were, for example, if you had a mortgage law that for some reason resulted in the fact that Hispanics could not get a mortgage, or all women were finding it very difficult or more women than men were finding it difficult to get a mortgage, then you would be able to sue over that law and say that it has a discriminatory effect or discriminatory outcome, rather than saying, well, Congress meant to harm us. And that really did actually help advance civil rights legislation or civil rights in general. So through that vehicle or just that change, discrimination could actually be shown in elections, in housing, and in schools, and in employment. So in conclusion, the civil rights struggle of African Americans created a model for other groups that has really been used effectively through today. Progress tends to occur when a majority takes up a minority's cause, and progress is often slow, and it doesn't happen naturally. It takes people like you and me actually going out and trying to make change. It just doesn't happen by itself. And you can scream and scream for a very long time, but unless someone's listening, then chances are it may not actually come to pass.